Hey, I'm Maggie.
And I'm Annika, and today we're going to discuss post-war anxieties in counterculture during the 1960s.
Awesome, but to do so, we're going to have to travel way back, all the way back to the 1950s, the origin of counterculture.
Let's go! Counterculture originated in the 1950s with a group of bohemian intellectuals and writers known as the Beat Generation. The group emerged in opposition to the post-war mainstream American culture, which was characterized by conservatism and conformity. Traditional gender roles were prevalent, styles were homologous, and many people participated in similar activities and occupations. This conformity was directly related to the anti-communist angst following World War II.
The Beat Generation was dissatisfied with these American standards, so they alienated themselves into a small underground movement. They introduced new concepts of societal forms. They shunned materialism and ultimately spawned a new drug culture. Prominent leaders included Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac.
Though the Beats generally maintained a low, apolitical profile, it was difficult to maintain their confidentiality as members began to tackle political issues. Their development eventually transformed into the counterculture of the 1960s.
So, if the Beats represented an alternative lifestyle in the 1950s, how was counterculture represented in the 1960s?
Let's find out.
In addition to the growing dissatisfaction towards the socially conservative and conformist mindset of the 1950s, various liberal groups composed of college and university students emerged to rebel against established authority in the early and mid-1960s. The radical student organization, called the Students for a Democratic Society, who began to identify with Blacks' struggle against oppressive controls and laws, was the first group to do so. The student movement, who followed the leadership of Tom Hayden, established what became known as the New Left, which were activists and intellectuals who supported Hayden's peace and justice-oriented ideas.
The SDS issued the Declaration of the Port Huron Statement, which called for participatory democracy, meaning students would have a vote in university decisions which affected their daily lives. This demand developed into a series of protests, with the first major student protest taking place in 1964 on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. The purpose of their self-named free speech movement was to end university restrictions on student political gatherings and activities. Their activism expanded to nationwide student protests against a variety of university rules, including those against drinking and dorm visits by the opposite sex. Student demonstrations proliferated with the U.S. increased involvement in the Vietnam War. So, I wonder if the student movement and the New Left had anything to do with the Flower Power movement later on.
It did.
The political activism of the student movement and the New Left went hand in hand with the new counterculture of the 1960s. The so-called hippies of the 1960s held the same ideals as the Beats, but they also promoted vibrant colored clothing, long hair, folk music, psychedelic drugs, and participation in politics. Members of the counterculture attempted to establish their own towns, economy, political institutions, and societal values. Famous hippie districts included Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, Greenwich Village, New York, and Old Town Chicago. Some of the largest events that promoted their good vibes lifestyle, rock and roll folk music, and alternative ways of thinking included the 1967 Human Be In event in Golden Gate Park, San Francisco, as well as the Woodstock Music Festival in New York. Popular artists and bands included the Beatles, Grateful Dead, and Elton John. Generally speaking, they wanted to overhaul domestic policy within the U.S.
So, there you have it. Counterculture brought peace, music, drugs, and an alternative lifestyle to American culture.
But wait, counterculture affected society in other ways, too. The hippie counterculture inspired a change in many Americans' attitudes toward sexual expression. The research and pioneering surveys of Alfred Kinsey in the late 40s and 50s, medicine, science, and media advertisements, movies, and magazines contributed to a more casual and open-minded outlook on premarital sex, homosexuality, contraception and abortion. The sexual revolution and the introduction of the birth control pill in 1960 contributed to a renewal of the women's movement in the 1960s.
So that wraps up post-war anxieties and counterculture in the 1960s. But how was counterculture abandoned if it was so popular? Great question, Annika.
There were many factors that led to the end of counterculture. The war ending in Vietnam was a huge factor for the downfall of counterculture. Many people joined the counterculture movement solely to fight the war in Vietnam, so when the war officially ended, many people didn't see a reason to stay. The biggest factor, however, was the infamous deaths and crimes connected with the hippie movement in the early 1970s. In 1969, Charles Manson and his hippie cult, called The Family, went on a brutal killing spree and murdered several people in the Hollywood Hills, including famed movie star Sharon Tate. The case and trial for the murders became internationally famous and tainted the counterculture movement. Because the media referred to the Manson family as hippies, the idea of the hippie commune became inverted and shattered. A similar case occurred the same year when a young African-American man named Meredith Hunter was stabbed by a Hells Angel at a Rolling Stones concert. The death was violent and brutal and rattled everyone who attended the concert. Many people considered Meredith's death a symbol for the death of the 1960s idealism and the lost innocence of rock and roll. By the mid-1970s, the peaceful and loving connotation that the term hippies embodied was replaced with murder and violence. This negative connotation and violent message led many to flee or disassociate themselves with counterculture, therefore causing a rapid downfall in the movement.
Wow, I'm glad I wasn't around for the early 1970s. Counterculture certainly doesn't seem as fun as it was in the 60s. Me too. Well, that wraps up our lesson on counterculture. Thanks for watching.